Colombian cartel boss Brian Castillo had just said the one sentence that made me freeze in the middle of my shift. She denied me. Take her. In that moment, what made my breath catch wasn't fear. It was the way he was looking at me. That wasn't the gaze of an insulted kingpin. It was the look of a man who had just seen something he never expected to find. The very second I turned away and kept walking. I had only said a perfectly professional sentence I'd use with any customer. "I'll get to you when I can, sir." But to him, it sounded like a challenge, or worse, an invitation he couldn't ignore. His men in their expensive cream suits moved toward me, but Brian raised one hand, stopping them mid-step. He stood from his table and walked toward me slowly, deliberately, like he was approaching something wild that might bolt if he moved too fast. "You made me wait," he said, his accented voice so low and smooth, it sent heat up the back of my neck, not from anger, from something far more dangerous. "So, tell me, Jenny, why did you do it?" I wanted to snap back, to tell him I was just doing my job, that the elderly couple at table 12 had been waiting longer than him. But my heart skipped a beat when he leaned in close. The scent of expensive cologne and something darker filling the space between us, his warm breath brushing against my cheek. "I want to know," he murmured, his dark eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. "Why you're the only woman in this entire city who looked at me and saw just another man." And in that moment, I finally got scared. Not of him, not of his power or his reputation or the guns his men carried beneath their jackets. I got scared of the feeling that he had already claimed a piece of my heart before he ever touched me, before I even knew his name. I am Jenny Newton. And with one simple act of professional dignity, refusing to drop everything for a man in an expensive suit, I made the most ruthless Colombian cartel boss in the city see me in a way that would either save my life or destroy it completely. What I didn't know then, standing in that softly lit restaurant with my tray trembling in my hands and his eyes burning into mine, was that Brian Castillo never let go of anything he decided belonged to him. And the moment I walked away, the moment I denied him what everyone else gave freely, I became his obsession. This is the story of how one word, wait, changed everything. The dinner rush was hitting its peak when Brian Castillo walked in, and I barely noticed. That probably sounds insane now, but in that moment, I was focused on Mrs. Chen and her husband celebrating their 50th anniversary at table 12. They'd been waiting 20 minutes for their entrees, and I could see the disappointment starting to cloud her face. That look, the one that said she'd been invisible her whole life and was still waiting to matter, that's what I couldn't ignore. So when the man in the cream suit at table 8 lifted his hand with that casual expectation of immediate obedience, I kept my back turned and finished garnishing the anniversary meal. I know it sounds crazy, but in my world, the priority was the warmth of that elderly woman's smile when I set down her plate, not the ego of some well-dressed man who thought the world stopped spinning when he walked into a room. I heard the shift in the restaurant's energy before I saw it. That sudden, suffocating silence that happens when danger walks among civilians. I turned around with my empty tray, and there he was, Brian Castillo, watching me with dark eyes that held something between amusement and disbelief. His lieutenant, a cold-eyed man in an equally expensive suit, was already moving toward me with the kind of controlled menace that made my survival instincts scream. "Miss," he said quietly, his accent thick, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "Mr. Castillo requires service now. I could feel every eye in the restaurant on me. The other servers had frozen mid-step. Even the kitchen had gone quiet. But I'd spent my entire life being treated like I was disposable. Like my time and my dignity didn't matter because I wore a uniform instead of designer clothes. So I met Carlos's cold stare and said the words that sealed my fate. Everyone waits their turn here. That's how respect works. The silence that followed was absolute. I heard someone gasp. A fork clattered against a plate. And then Brian Castillo stood up slowly, deliberately, that slight smile on his face that somehow felt more dangerous than any threat. She denied me, he said softly, never taking his eyes off mine. Take her. The walk from the dining room to the black SUV parked outside felt like crossing into another dimension. Carlos's hand barely touched my elbow, but the pressure was absolute, guiding me with the kind of control that told me struggling would be pointless. The interior of the vehicle smelled like leather and expensive cologne, and Brian was already seated in the back, sipping something amber from a crystal glass. Like this was a Tuesday afternoon meeting, not a kidnapping. He didn't speak immediately. He just studied me with those dark, calculating eyes, letting the silence do the work of intimidation. When he finally spoke, his accented English was smooth, almost gentle. "Who sent you to watch me?" I actually laughed, a short, shocked sound that made Carlos shift in the driver's seat. The question was so disconnected from my reality of double shifts and overdue rent that it felt absurd. "I'm a waitress," I said, meeting his gaze. "I can barely afford groceries." Who exactly would I be spying for? But he wasn't buying it. He studied every micro-expression on my face, comparing my strange calmness to whatever fear he usually saw in people he pulled into his world. Most people would be crying, begging. I was just exhausted. Exhausted from being underestimated, from being invisible, and now exhausted from being suspected of being some kind of super spy. Then his phone buzzed. He answered in rapid Spanish, listened, and his expression shifted, just slightly, but I caught it. When he hung up, he sat back against the leather seat and reassessed me entirely. "The restaurant security system was hacked," he said slowly. "The exact moment I arrived. You weren't ignoring me because you're brave or stupid. Someone used you as the perfect distraction." He paused, running a hand over his jaw. "You're not a spy, but you're also not afraid. And that, Jenny Newton, makes you either very valuable or very dangerous." Before I could process how he knew my name, he made an offer that should have terrified me. "Work for me? 30 days? Help me find who's betraying me from inside my organization, and I'll give you more money than you'd make in 5 years of serving tables." I was about to refuse when my phone buzzed. A text from my manager. "Don't come back. We can't afford cartel trouble. You're done." Just like that, my entire life collapsed. Fired for telling a powerful man to wait his turn. And Brian Castillo, watching me read that text with those unnervingly perceptive eyes, knew he had me exactly where he needed me. The first cartel meeting happened 3 days into my 30-day contract, and I knew immediately I'd made a terrible mistake. The room was all dark wood paneling and cigar smoke, filled with men in expensive suits who looked at me like I was something Brian had tracked in on his shoe. I was wearing a borrowed black dress that didn't quite fit, standing in the corner like a piece of furniture, exactly as Brian had instructed. "Just observe," he'd said. "Say nothing. See everything." The mocking started before I even sat down. They spoke in Spanish, assuming I was just another pretty face who couldn't understand them. "Es esta su nueva mascota?" one older man asked with a cruel laugh. "Is this his new pet?" Another joined in, wondering aloud if Brian was collecting strays now, or if I was just warming his bed until he gets bored. I kept my face blank, my hands folded in my lap, letting them think I was too stupid or too intimidated to comprehend their contempt. But every word landed like a slap, stripping away the thin veneer of dignity I'd been clinging to. Then one bold associate, a man with slicked back hair and too much cologne, addressed Brian directly in English, his voice dripping with barely concealed disrespect. "Tell me, Castillo, have you gone soft for a pretty face, or is she just entertainment until the real work begins?" I waited for Brian to say something, anything, to shut him down. But he just sipped his whiskey and smiled that dangerous smile that never reached his eyes. The message was clear. I was on my own. The real humiliation came when Isabella Reyes swept into the room like she owned it. She was everything I wasn't, polished, elegant, with perfect hair and a designer dress that probably cost more than my rent for a year. She moved through the space with the confidence of someone who'd always belonged in rooms like this, and when her eyes landed on me, they were cold and assessing. She walked over to where I was sitting, holding a glass of deep red wine, and stood close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. For a moment, I thought she might actually speak to me like a human being. Instead, she tilted her glass just slightly, and the entire contents spilled down the front of my borrowed dress, the wine spreading across the fabric like blood. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she said, her voice saccharine and venomous. "I suppose that's what happens when one doesn't know their place in this world." The room went silent. Every man watched, waiting to see if Brian would finally defend me, if I was actually worth something to him or just a disposable prop. But Brian didn't move, didn't even glance in my direction. He kept his attention fixed on the man speaking at the head of the table, his face a perfect mask of indifference. In that moment, I felt something inside me crack, not break. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction, but definitely crack. I stood up slowly, the wine dripping onto the expensive carpet, and walked with as much dignity as I could summon toward the restroom, refusing to let them see how deeply their cruelty had cut. I was standing at the sink, pressing paper towels against the stain, when Isabella walked in to reapply her lipstick. She didn't acknowledge me at first, just checked her reflection with that self-satisfied smile. But as she adjusted her hair, I noticed something that made my breath catch, a distinctive emerald ring on her right hand, ornate and unmistakable. I'd seen that ring before, in a news article about Diego Morales, the rival cartel leader who'd been moving aggressively into Brian's territory. The article had shown Morales wearing that exact ring, his family crest, a symbol of power passed down through generations. Isabella caught me staring and smiled wider, like she knew exactly what I just realized, but didn't think I was smart enough to do anything about it. That night, I was walking past one of the private offices in Brian's compound when I heard her voice, low and urgent, speaking in Spanish on the phone. I pressed myself against the wall and listened as she confirmed plans to draw Castillo out to the waterfront for what she called the final meeting. The way she said it, with that cold satisfaction, made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution. I didn't sleep that night. I paced my small room, turning over everything I'd seen and heard, knowing I was the only person who'd connected the dots. By morning, I'd made my decision. I found Brian in his office, looking over shipping manifests like nothing was wrong. Like he hadn't just let me be publicly humiliated to maintain his precious neutrality. I walked straight up to his desk and slammed my hands down on the polished wood. "Either you start treating me like someone with a brain and eyes," I said, my voice shaking with fury and fear, or I walk out right now and you can get ambushed without me." For the first time since I'd met him, Brian Castillo looked genuinely surprised. Brian listened to everything I told him: the emerald ring, the overheard conversation, the waterfront meeting, his face growing darker with each detail. He didn't question me, didn't dismiss my observations as paranoid or insignificant. He simply picked up his phone and made 3 calls in rapid Spanish, his voice cold and precise as he set his countermeasure in motion. Isabella was taken at the waterfront before she ever made it to Diego Morales. Brian's men found encrypted messages on her phone going back 8 months. Detailed information about shipments, meeting locations, security rotations. She'd been bleeding his operation dry, feeding everything to his biggest rival, and I'd caught her because I noticed a ring. For one brief, shining moment, I thought I'd proven myself, that I'd earned my place at his side, that the humiliation had been worth something. Then the whispers started. They moved through the underworld like poison, reaching Brian's allies, his associates, the men whose support kept his empire standing. "Castillo's finished. He's letting a nobody waitress run his operation. He's gone soft, making decisions based on pillow talk. A black girl from nowhere is calling the shots now." I heard it all because they wanted me to hear it. They said it in hallways, in meetings, loud enough for me to catch every venomous word. I watched powerful men, the ones who'd sat in that room and mocked me, begin to distance themselves from Brian. Phone calls went unreturned. Alliances that had stood for years started to fracture. I wasn't his strength. I was his fatal weakness, the living proof that he'd lost his edge. Carlos found me standing alone on one of the compound's balconies, staring out at the city lights and wondering how saving Brian's life had somehow destroyed it. He didn't approach with his usual cold efficiency. Instead, he leaned against the railing beside me, and when he spoke, his voice carried genuine concern. "In our world, love is a death sentence," he said quietly. "They'll kill you to hurt him, Jenny. And then they'll kill him for mourning you. That's how it always ends." I wanted to argue that it wasn't love, that this was just business, a 30-day contract. But we both knew I'd be lying. The anonymous note arrived at my apartment 2 days later, slipped under the door while I was sleeping. Just 8 words in block letters. "Leave now. This is your only warning." I sat on my worn couch, holding that note in shaking hands, and finally understood the full weight of what I'd walked into. This wasn't a romance. It wasn't even really a partnership. It was a target on my back, painted there the moment Brian decided I was worth keeping close. I thought about my small, quiet life before him. The invisibility that used to feel like suffocation now looked like safety. I could disappear, change my name, move to another city where Colombian cartel bosses didn't know I existed. I could survive. But when I closed my eyes, I saw Brian's face when I'd told him about Isabella. That flash of respect, of recognition, like he was finally seeing me as something more than a distraction or a liability. I saw the way he'd listened to me, trusted my eyes and my instincts when everyone else dismissed me as entertainment. The question burning in my chest wasn't whether I'd stay. It was whether Brian would ultimately choose his empire over my survival when the choice became impossible to avoid. And deep down, in the part of me that had learned hard lessons about power and self-preservation, I already knew the answer. Men like Brian Castillo didn't choose love over power. They couldn't afford to. Diego Morales had set up the camera with care, making sure Brian could see everything. The abandoned warehouse, the rope binding my wrists to the metal chair, the knife pressed against my throat. His voice was smooth and confident as he delivered his ultimatum through the live feed. Choose, Castillo, your waterfront territory and shipping routes, or this woman dies on camera in the next 5 minutes. I wanted to be brave. I wanted to sit there with my chin up and my eyes defiant, but instead I wept. Not from fear of death. I'd made peace with that the moment Morales' men threw me in the van. I cried because I knew what Brian should choose, what he had to choose. His empire was everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for. My life wasn't worth watching it all crumble. Choose the territory, I whispered, even though Brian couldn't hear me through the camera. Please, just choose the territory. Morales laughed, tightening his grip on the knife. See, Castillo? Even she knows what you should do. Even she knows she's not worth... The warehouse door exploded inward with a deafening crash. Brian came through the smoke and chaos like something unleashed, moving with lethal precision through Morales' men. He wasn't leading an army. He'd come alone, armed with nothing but raw determination and a single weapon. Morales' face shifted from triumph to genuine shock. "You came alone?" he shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. "For her?" Brian didn't answer. He just kept moving forward, bullets tearing through the space around him, his focus locked entirely on me. When Morales raised his gun, Brian threw himself across the final distance, his body covering mine completely as 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. I felt the impact through him, felt his body jerk with each bullet that tore into his back and side. He gasped against my neck, his breath hot and ragged, but his arms tightened around me, refusing to let go. "She denied me," he whispered through gritted teeth, his accent thick with pain, "and I still chose her." Morales was reloading, shouting orders to his remaining men, moving closer to finish what he'd started. But through my terror and the ringing in my ears, I saw it. A gun on the concrete floor, kicked aside in the chaos, just inches from my bound hands. I stretched, my shoulders screaming in protest, my fingers brushing the cold metal. With my wrists still tied together, I gripped the weapon clumsily, raised it with shaking hands, and fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Morales staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. He collapsed, and the warehouse fell into sudden, ringing silence. Brian was still draped over me, his weight growing heavier, his breathing shallow. I could feel his blood soaking through my clothes, warm and terrifying. His men burst through the doors seconds later, securing the scene, but I barely registered them. I was too focused on Brian's face as Carlos cut my bindings, and I caught him before he could fall. "You came for me," I whispered, cradling his head in my lap, pressing my hands against his wounds. "You chose me." He managed a weak smile, his hand finding mine and gripping it with surprising strength. "You're not mine because I took you," he said, his voice rough but certain. "You're mine because you stayed and fought when you could have run." The doctors saved him. 3 bullets removed, countless stitches, weeks of recovery. And through it all, I stayed. Not because I was bound by contract or fear or even love, though that was definitely there, growing fiercer every day. I stayed because I'd finally found a place where my strength meant something, where my dignity wasn't a liability, but a weapon. I never went back to waitressing. I became something else entirely. Brian's partner, his conscience, the grounded center of his chaotic empire. The woman who proved that power isn't about where you come from or what you look like. It's about refusing to let anyone reduce you to less than you are. They still whisper about me in the underworld. The waitress who became a queen. The woman who killed to save the man who chose her over everything. But here's what they don't understand. I didn't need Brian Castillo to give me worth. I had that all along. I just needed someone to finally see it. And once I saw it in myself, no one could ever take it away. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, power, and finding your voice when the world wants you silent.